Hello students, welcome to EPG Patashala. I am K. Muralidhar. I am an honorary professor in South Asian University, New Delhi. Today we are going to discuss about a module which we have given a name as Biodiversity and Evolution. The objectives about this module are: at the end of the module, one will be able to get familiar with the flora and fauna of our country to their natural habitats, realize the importance of biodiversity for human survival, appreciate the beauty and splendor of biodiversity of our country in terms of the different ecosystems, develop respect and a sense of curiosity about our immediate surroundings for all forms of life and their cultural link to human life, and also develop interest in visiting biodiversity parks, game sanctuaries, national parks, conservation methods by tribal people and aborigines of our country, and also realize the importance of public health and its dependence on clean environment, both physical and biological. Biodiversity refers to richness of flora and fauna in a given region. In other words, the variety of organisms on earth, in the air, in the water, and in the soil is expressed quantitatively as biodiversity index. On the basis of this richness, labels like biodiversity hotspot are coined. India has two of the world's hotspots, one in eastern Himalayas and another in western Ghats. Biodiversity can be quantitated and there are standard techniques for that. Biodiversity comprises three components: genetic diversity, species diversity, and community and ecosystem diversity. What is important to understand is the accepted fact that biodiversity is the result of evolution of life on earth in the last 2.5 billion years. For many scientists, the whole earth is taken as a complete but complex but a single living organism. This is according to the so-called Gaia hypothesis. Nevertheless, it is estimated that there are more than 10 million species on this earth. The variability in genetic structure, that means chemistry, within number members of a given species gives rise to breeds, races, cultivars, and others. And this is called genetic diversity. These structural differences in the genetic material could be in chromosome structure, whole genes, whether they are present or not in functional state, allelic differences, or even epigenetic changes in certain genes. In general, in breeding in animals, inbreeding in animals, example say dog breeds, or humans, consanguineous marriages leads to decrease in diversity and ultimately to sterility. Green revolution led the higher productivity or led to the higher productivity, but also led to loss of genetic diversity. Species diversity simply means number of species, that is biotic types, surviving in a given ecosystem. Tropical rainforests, deserts, oceans, and treetops do not have the same biodiversity index. A community consists of producers, macro consumers, and micro consumers. An ecosystem can be scored for diversity also in terms of alpha diversity, beta diversity, and gamma diversity. We have listed a little bit about biodiversity of India in terms of what groups of organisms, including plants like angiosperms, how many are there in the country, and what is the status with respect to comparison with the rest of the world. So as you notice, there are number of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians among the animals. They are represented in India with a number of species, and this also tells you that we have very rich in angiosperms or flowering plants as they are called. We notice from here some endangered animals. As we know, that biodiversity description also describes the status of their numbers or population size over a period of time, and the so-called red book tells you that some of these organisms are either threatened or endangered. Endangered means their population size has dwindled to a great extent, creating alarm among the people, and some are listed here. The first one is shown. This is a so-called lion-tailed macaque, or scientifically called as Macaca selinus. Is another example of an endangered animal, which is essentially the Bengal tiger. Is a picture of what we popularly call as black buck. As you know, in Rajasthan, there is a community called Vishnois who essentially are involved in the conservation of this. Almost they have a divine respect for this animal, and some of you also who read newspapers have read about certain court cases that are running against a popular Bollywood film star who happened to be involved in killing one of them. We don't know the truth about it, but black buck is one of the endangered animals, and the Vishnoi community has realized this, hence they almost worship it and don't allow any external influence on this animal. Essentially represents cheetah, and as you notice, a characteristic feature is something like a black mark which starts from the eyes and reaches the mouth, which looks like tears, but essentially this is a characteristic marker of cheetah, from which we can distinguish cheetah from leopards. Indicates another example of an endangered animal endemic to India, which is known as the Gangetic dolphin, scientifically called as Platanista gangetica. Essentially indicates the great Indian hornbill, one of the beautiful birds, highly colored, scientifically called as Bucero bicornis, and this also is a endangered animal. Indicates another example of an endangered animal, popularly called as the Indian python and scientifically called as Python monurus monurus. Children are very fascinated by the huge size of this, and there are a lot of folk tales about how a python can literally eat up a goat sized animal. Indicates another example of an endangered animal, popularly called as a golden langur, or scientifically called as Presbytis ga. Is the famous Indian gharial, scientifically called as Gavialis gangeticus, found largely in the river Ganges, and this also is almost endangered in its status. Is example of yet another animal, but which is very close to Indian culture, especially South Indian temple culture, who we call this as Asian elephant, scientifically called as Elephas maximus. Over a period of centuries now, this is one of the most famous domesticated animals, and they are used as a draught animal in forest areas, as well as religious animal to carry idols of Hindu gods. And this you can come across beautifully dressed and decorated elephants in the temples of Kerala. And this animal, unfortunately, is now listed as an endangered animal. Probably one of the last examples of these endangered animals, which is called popularly as green sea turtle, or in scientific terms it is known as Chelonia midas. By now, most of you must have realized that we have these endangered animals practically from every group of organisms that we have earlier shown, and therefore it becomes increasingly moral duty of all citizens and the governments to see to it that these don't disappear from the face of earth, and they're all conserved. And government has initiated a number of protocols for conservation of all these representative animal species. Deals with a topic which we referred to in the earlier module, where we talked about the Darwinian idea of evolution. Today it is a central concept in biology. I can even go ahead and tell that this theory of organic evolution by natural selection has essentially become a paradigm, or one of the greatest concepts in human history. Here is a slide which will tell you, essentially gives you an idea of timeline of origin and evolution of life forms. Our Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and approximately about 3.5 billion years back, life originated on Earth. Subsequently, in the last 1.5 billion years, these life forms have evolved. And this timeline is described here in the form of statements which say that the Earth and the atmosphere was formed first. This is about 4.5 billion years back. Then the primordial seas were formed. We still don't know the mechanisms behind it. Complex organic molecules were formed. There are some scientific experiments which indicated how these molecules could have formed and what kind of conditions led to the formation of these molecules. Then some of these polymerized, and we got polymers of amino acids were formed, and they spontaneously replicated also through simple chemical reactions. And then we got complex organic molecules, which we call as biomolecules, became concentrated in cell precursors, and somehow later this led to what we call the first prokaryotes were formed with an envelope enclosing all these soup of chemicals. And then autotrophic prokaryotes were formed. Autotrophic means it refers to their ability to make their food from inorganic constituents like carbon dioxide and water with the help of sunlight. And then we notice that aerobic organisms came on Earth, and because it was preceded by the production of oxygen, and that led to development of photosynthetic bacteria and other aerobic organisms. Then eukaryotic cells were formed through a process called as endosymbiosis, and this is a popular idea which is acceptable to most of the biologists, that the existing organisms, unicellular organisms, essentially engulfed some prokaryotes, and they later became the so-called mitochondria and nuclei, which we come across in eukaryotic organisms. And this diversified through what we call as Darwinian evolutionary processes, and therefore ended up as complex organisms. So in a sense, therefore, evolution, if you talk in terms of biological complexity, there is a gradual increase of complexity in the structure as well as in functioning of organisms throughout the period of evolution. Gives you a artificial picture, a cartoon-like picture about the kind of diversity of organisms that have evolved over a period of time in the ocean bed, as is indicated here. Also tells you that if you look at one group of organisms, which we broadly call as reptiles, and some of you are familiar that in the very, very olden days, long back, there were animals called as dinosaurs. Their present living examples of this related to this family are the crocodiles and lizards that we see still today. So if you look at these dinosaurs and the varieties of dinosaurs that were there, they were all evolved long back in eons in epochs and billions of years back. And an example is put up here. Also tells you that the kind of evolutionary examples that we can discuss. Here are some different groups of mammals that are indicated on the top left portion, which includes man, who seem to have originated and differentiated from ape-like precursors. There are other examples given of mammals which are seen in the slide. And the down or the bottom portion also lists some more interesting mammals like the tiger, the horse, the deer, the giraffe, and many others like rhinoceros, elephant, and all, how they have evolved over a period of time. How did we realize all these things? While earlier people described the diversity, it was Darwin who gave us this idea of evolution by natural selection, and therefore, from those days onwards, we talk about evolution of living organisms. However, how did Darwin get these ideas? Charles Darwin went on a voyage in a ship called Beagle, and he made along with a geologist called Lyell, who was basically investigating the origin and diversification of rock systems on this earth. And Darwin went along with him and collected a huge system or listing of organisms, plants, animals, and all. And while analyzing them, their structures and what do they do and all, he was struck with this idea that this diversity is not constant, that yesterday's diversity is different from today's diversity, and therefore he formulated this idea of that all these living organisms evolve over a period of time which takes millions of years. But his ideas came essentially by observations of two phenomena. One are the shells of tortoises and the beaks of birds, and when he noticed them, he noticed their adaptive significance in Galapagos Islands, and therefore evolved or got the idea of organic evolution. Essentially is a picture or a cartoon of the beak shapes that Darwin observed on these islands. And the one thing that he observed and therefore drew conclusion was that the shape of the beak, including the texture, the strength, and all that, essentially was related to the dietary habits or what they eat, these birds, which we call as foraging behavior. And this perfect adaptation of these gave him this idea that the beaks essentially evolved to adapt to the kind of diet components that are available for these birds to eat and survive. Darwin's theory has to be understood. Darwin formulated this theory of organic evolution in 1859 by publishing a book. It was also contributed by another scientist called Wallace. Now, this theory of organic evolution by natural selection is popularly called as Darwin's theory. It is also called as survival of the fittest, but this phrase was not used by Darwin. There is a variation in the phenotypic characteristics of any given group population. These variations, which increase the fitness of that particular group, would better adapt to the environment and survive in leaving large number of offspring. This is euphemistically called natural selection, which selects the favorable trait and against unfavorable trait. The selection, or what we called as natural selection, is of various types, precisely about 4 types, and these are listed here: a stabilizing selection, a directional selection, a disruptive selection, and a sexual selection. Should I give more on this or no? We just read. Gives an example of what the biologists call as artificial selection. While Darwin's ideas of selection and evolution of organisms essentially refer to natural selection, that means selection carried out by nature, man also has learnt to domesticate a large number of animals And in due course of time, this domestication also led to evolution of special breeds. Classic examples you can see among dogs, horses and all, where different groups of our human beings have developed different breeds among these dogs, horses. And that we call it as artificial selection, because it is a man who selected them and not nature. Similarly, another example one can quote is the increasing use of antibiotics by human beings has also led to development of antibiotic resistance in microbes, and this can be demonstrated even in the laboratory by in vitro experiments, where within few generations of exposure to high concentrations of antibiotics, people notice that the microbes become resistant and therefore keep growing, dividing in spite of presence of large number of antibiotics. And this is therefore another example of an artificial selection that is operative. These examples give us more faith and confidence that Darwinian ideas are absolutely right. Essentially reiterates what were told earlier, that the present day domesticated dogs of different breeds essentially were domesticated from wild wolf, and here are some examples shown in this slide. That means these domesticated dogs are related to their wildlife representatives which live in wildlife. A standard question in biology is one, at what level natural selection operates, and that is at the population level. However, at a molecular level, if you look at, we notice that evolution occurs in macromolecules also. That is, when we refer to macromolecules, we are talking of DNA and proteins thereby. Now, both these DNA and protein, they have a chemistry, they have a structure, which means DNA is made up of nucleotides which are linked to each other in phosphodiester linkage. Proteins are made up of amino acids and they are linked by peptide bond. Whenever there is a mutation in the DNA chemistry, that is DNA structure, the genetic code sequence of nucleotide triplet codon will undergo alteration, and therefore when a messenger RNA made out of that code is translated in the cell, the protein sequence also will be altered, and therefore you say there is a phenotypic alteration. Selection pressure can operate at the level of mutation, causing and survival of some of these good mutations which lead to better adaptation, and elimination of those mutations which lead to not a good survival. It is also interesting to know who our ancestors were, because this is a fundamental curiosity of all human beings, thinking individuals. It is generally understood that the descent of man is from ape-like structures or ape-like creatures or organisms. Eugene Dubois discovered this and reported for the first time. Essentially deals with the one aspect of evolution, and that is the evolution of human beings. And the current thinking is that human beings or modern man, when we say man, it includes woman also. Modern human beings have evolved from ape-like precursors. It means both the currently available apes like chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, and the modern man have come from common origins. One branch went into those so-called subhuman primates or apes, and another branch evolved into modern man. And this one raises the question of what are those dramatic changes that occurred in the body during the evolution of man from ape-like precursors. And these are listed here. For example, the arms, elbow joint, the brain became larger and more rounder. The feet, heel changed to take impact better. Hands were modified in the sense that the thumb and the first finger could hold itself, and therefore grasping became very available for these man-like organisms. Then the jaws and the teeth also have shrunk. Flattening of face helps in language development because cerebral cortex also developed along with this. The knees became changed so that man walks upright, unlike the so-called ape-like precursors. No waddling, running is possible. As you notice, two-legged animals can run, and man is one of the finest examples for this. And then the tails disappeared. Of course, apes do not have tails, and they became vestigial in the case of human beings, and you call it as coccyx bone, which you can notice in man. Essentially gives a pictorial representation of this evolution of modern man from ape-like precursors, and people start this story from organisms which are combinedly called as Ramapithecus and Dryopithecus. From there, certain human being like organisms, these are combinedly called as Homo habilis, and then we get Homo erectus during a period of time, and one branch, Neanderthal man, evolved, and then another branch, the so-called modern man, who is also called as Homo sapiens sapiens, evolved, and these are represented. Basically, these ideas have come from analysis of what we call as fossils by anthropologists as well as archaeologists. Dramatically gives one of these changing features when ape-like precursors became man, and this is in the skull shape and the brain property. As you notice from this figure, the skull of a modern man, adult, resembles more the skull of a baby chimpanzee. And therefore, people have said that chimpanzee-like precursors have been on one branch of evolution from a common precursor, whereas another branch went in and developed as modern man. When Darwin formulated his theory of organic evolution, something that was bugging him and subsequent generation of scientists was, where is this variation? How is it originating? And how does it acted upon by natural selection? We have to understand inheritance as a phenomena to understand this phenomena. We inherit genes from parents. Variation in the genes occurs during meiotic recombination in all sexually reproducing organisms. There are different patterns of inheritance. Mendel formulated what are called as Mendelian laws of inheritance, which refers to one type of inheritance. Some characters are sex-linked. That means the genes are on sex chromosomes, usually the X chromosome. And therefore, you see associated with this phenomena sex-linked diseases. Gives an example of one of the questions that confront biologists. How is the gender, popularly called as gender, technically called as sex, how is this determined? Here is a picture which tells you that in the case of human beings, and there are many other examples on the same basis, we have what are called as chromosomes, which are genetic material, and there are 46 of them in every adult diploid organism, man and woman. So they are divided as 23 pairs. Now, during the production of gametes, that is sperms by the man and eggs by the woman, these 46 chromosomes are divided into their gametes, but as half of them, which are called as haploid number. And therefore, you have eggs which have got haploid number 23 and sperms which have haploid number 23. However, one of the pairs are called as sex chromosomes, and man has two types of them, X chromosome, but another one which is uniquely present as in man called as Y chromosome. And therefore, you have two types of sperms produced by man, X-bearing sperms and Y-bearing sperms, whereas in the case of the woman, all the eggs have got this X chromosome or sex chromosome of the female. So when these gametes fertilize each other, and the fertilized egg develops as an embryo, and then the fetus, and then ultimately delivered as a newborn, and this newborn grows up, what we get is either a boy or a girl, essentially depending upon whether a X-bearing sperm fertilized a X-bearing egg or a Y-bearing sperm fertilized X-bearing egg. Depending on that, therefore, you get an XY composition, which means essentially a boy, and XX composition, which means essentially a girl. Gives you a little example, an interesting example of how eye color is inherited. This happens to be due to a what we call as a recessive gene, but present on the sex chromosome. And therefore you see different examples of how a brown eye colored father and a blue eye colored woman, or vice versa, or the eye color is inherited in their next filial progeny. And because this is a recessive gene, only a double representation in the future progeny gives rise to this so-called blue color, as is given in the bottom. One of the girls children called Jen, she has blue. Otherwise, we notice that either the homozygous brown or heterozygous blue plus brown essentially gives rise to brown eyes, as you see at the bottom given in the number of children with their names. Indicates an interesting example how a mutation in a given gene gives rise to dramatically new type of phenotype among the existing population. Here is a albino child born to so-called black parents, and this is because the skin color is due to the melanin distribution and the melanin formation by an enzyme called tyrosinase, and the gene for that, if there is a mutation, these pigments are not formed, and therefore the whole skin looks like white color, or strictly it is called as albino color. So a familiar look at this superficially will tell you that this child cannot be the child of these parents, but indeed genetic evidence tells you that the same gene is inherited, but this is a mutated gene, and therefore the white child can be born to black parents. Essentially summarizes the wisdom about this whole evolutionary process. What is important and very profound truth about this is that extinction is the certain end of the road of evolution. However, one should understand that evolution is directionless, but natural selection is deterministic. It requires enormous amount of reflective thought to understand the significance of these two statements. He is an example of this prediction that all evolution will end up in extinction, and one of the visible examples is the African elephant, or the giant elephant, which slightly differs from the Asian elephant. This is almost now moving towards extinction unless man takes urgent measures for their conservation. At the end, in summary, let us see what we have learnt in this. Biodiversity simply means the richness of living forms in terms of numbers, species, and habitats. As all living forms are interdependent directly or indirectly, loss of biodiversity will affect biodiversity of some other species or even some other habitats. Anthropogenic destruction of habitat leading to loss of biodiversity is threatening the very survival of man on this earth. Hence, biodiversity should be conserved as it renders many eco-services. Biodiversity changes over a period of time, and this phenomenon is also called evolution, literally. Darwinian ideas explain evolution well. Of particular interest is the descent of man from ape-like precursors. Modern man appeared approximately 50,000 years back in many places on earth. It is not very clear whether cultural evolution has overtaken biological evolution now in the case of man. Thank you very much for your patience.